outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Cool. Hello, everybody watching. Morning, Will, Joe, Tarjinder. Hope you're all doing well. Welcome to Points of View. So we've got two, hopefully, interesting topics today. The first one, very sort of prescient at the moment, is the big strategic defense review. And I'm not sure how much our viewers and listeners know that there's actually an education part of it, apart from all the tech and IT and hackers stuff that's been making the news. But one of the big headlines that is in the education part is that as part of the strategic review, children are to be taught the value of military at school. The strategic defense review, to be published tomorrow, will state that pupils should be educated on the importance of the armed forces. I'm just going to give a bit more context here from the article. The key recommendation will be published on Monday, will state that school students should be educated on the importance of the armed forces. They will the Ministry of Defense will work with the education sector that the military can forge closer links with young people. And these lessons will also be designed to help young people learn about career opportunities within defense. So this is an interesting one. I don't know if people are really up with this. I think it's an interesting idea. What are our immediate thoughts? Tarjinder, what are you thinking about this one? So, Tarjinder, you there?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to unmute and it just wouldn't let me. I just think it's just another thing to teach, and I don't necessarily mind the idea of it, because if they're not active enough in terms of careers advice and they want to do more, that's fair enough. I don't see a problem because there's already something there. You know, people come in to do careers advice all the time. But if it's just another means of like trying to teach children something, what to think about things, I just don't agree with it. Like, I don't agree with it on either side. I don't agree with sort of like some of the lefty agitating that goes on, and the fact that, you know, people think they can just put the politics in all the time. And I don't agree with this either, because I don't think that you should have to think that the military is a good thing. I think you're allowed to not think that. What we shouldn't be doing is actively teaching against it, but I don't think that's happening.
What are your thoughts? Anybody else want to jump in? Joe or Will?
When I first read that headline, eye rolling started with the, oh my gosh, exactly as we've said, just another thing to squeeze into an already cramped PSHE curriculum that's just already whack full of all sorts of different things. Then I read it a little bit more closely, and I'm always mindful of the fact that it's in the Telegraph, and I like to be a little bit strident about some of those things. But most of the time, certainly in my school, but talking to a lot of CEIAG leads that I'm familiar with, they are often the military a go-to bunch of people who we invite to careers fairs, that we talk an awful lot. But I actually don't think there's anything wrong with maybe knowing a little bit more about those things and those opportunities that the military can offer. I often look to myself around, you know, I trained to be a teacher, went to university, blah, blah, blah. My knowledge about things like apprenticeships is pretty rubbish. It still is, despite the best efforts of some people I work with, as career opportunities. My knowledge of apprenticeships in the military was absolutely developed exponentially through a conversation with one of my year 11s the other day, who was talking about the opportunities that they were looking into for careers within the military that were not anything I'd ever thought of or heard of or considered. And it was really interesting debate, because one of my other kids, they're quite passionate, some of the kids that I teach, was talking about, yeah, but you've got to give your life over to something for 2 years and you won't be able to do this. And how about, you know, all of these different aspects of things. And I think those are the things that we don't often talk about maybe in school. We chuck some leaflets at some kids, or the army turn up, or the Navy, the RAF, whoever, they turn up and they either do charity things, assault courses they bring into school. They do that kind of experience the military type of days, or they stand behind a table and talk about recruitment. But that real interest and engaging debate, I think, does have place, does have value, because we generally do kind of stop our teaching at this is what happened in wars past, not what the military do now.
What are your thoughts, Will?
Yeah, covered by what Joe was saying there about the military of the past. Well, that's going to come up in your history teaching anyway. I mean, it's very difficult to teach history well without communicating, and I say value, not necessarily in the sense of, oh, everything the military does is great. Of course, I don't mean that. What I mean by value is the significant role the military has played in the history of this country, like as in most countries' histories. So I think if you're teaching your history properly, that's going to be communicated to the children already. I've only seen, there's not that much detail in the article about exactly what this will look like in the classroom. I suspect because it isn't happening yet, so no one really knows. What I wonder as I read this is this some meaningful change to our children's education, or is it going to be 45 minutes on a Wednesday in November that you do once, you tick that box, and then you move on, and there's not really much development of it? Like both Joe and I think Tarjinder have mentioned as well, one other thing is the future of the military, which of course is going to be made up of the young people of today. And maybe it's part of this wider trend of I think there's this widespread sense now that university is becoming less of a default for those academically, or for children, or maybe recommending university is becoming, I think we're thinking twice about doing that. And actually, obviously the military is a very large employer, and one way of looking at it is, yes, you pledge, your life, or quite literally in a sense you do. You are going to go work with the military for a couple of years. But another way of looking at that is, they're really going to take care of you, and they will provide you with lots of skills and accommodation and a sort of support network of sorts that lots of young people really, really need in life. And especially if they're not going to go to university because maybe it's become too expensive for them, or it won't pay off once they get out of university, maybe this will actually become quite an attractive, a more attractive option for young people in the near future.
I mean, I guess my point is, I agree with what you're saying to a point, but I do think what makes them special, like I have no problems with them coming into recruitment days. I have no problems with that idea that you're putting forward, Will. I guess what worries me is this idea that somehow by incorporating it within the curriculum and just reading a bit more, the wartime generation leaves us. We need to keep the message and spirit of what they fought for alive. Learning the history of what happened is important. Seeing what people do now to keep us safe. It seems to be implying that the way you recruit, I think the way you recruit for the military is what you were saying, Will, which is, hey, we'll pay for your degree and you can actually be supported and you can have money. But this seems to be implying that the way you do it is by I think it edges onto indoctrination, that somehow the military is special enough that by teaching how awesome it was in the past, now young people will be wanting to join, which is what worries me. I just don't believe that, I guess it comes down to, should they have a special place in the curriculum? Are they that important that is how they should be allowed to recruit?
I'm going to suggest, and I know wading into deep waters here, but let's go. I'm going to suggest that particularly the Second World War really occupies a huge part of our national consciousness, and the sense of what people did and sacrificed and everything during those years is a huge part of, let's call it the British national story, the story we tell ourselves. And what you said there, as the wartime generation dies out, which is going to happen very, very soon, any living witness to that will be gone. There's this sense of, well, what else do we found our national story on? Well, if the people are gone, maybe what we need to do is build a firmer sense among children nowadays, for whom this seems unimaginably distant. We need to build a firmer sense for them of how close this country came to the precipice of extinction in the 1940s.
What do you think, Tarjinder?
I mean, I think it's going to be a bit disingenuous for anybody who comes from any kind of left-wing perspective to go, it's indoctrination, given like basically what goes on in schools all the time in terms of like other things that are being taught. Because let's face it, there's no left-wing politics that hasn't been shoved into a school. So to that extent, actually, fair enough. Maybe they're just playing you at your own game. Do you know what I mean? To some extent, it's like, well, they do it, so why not us? I'd rather it didn't happen at all. I'd rather we were way more mindful about these things. If you look at the PSHE curriculum, even from the PSHE Association, it's quite obvious that they haven't thought things through. There are plenty of things that you've got to say, well, why are they implementing it? Why are we even talking about gender identity to like primary school kids, for example? I mean, tell me that's not indoctrination, because it seems like that to me, right? So to that extent, if they want to jump on the bandwagon, I don't blame them, but I don't agree with it. Having said that, I think they need to think about their own recruitment campaign, which a couple of years ago, they were like putting things out about how like everybody was welcome. Now, if you want to go into the military, you want to be a strong person, you do it because you want to be brave, you want to be courageous. And yet they seem to be, sort of recruiting these sort of snowflakes, quite frankly. And so they kind of did themselves a disservice by doing that. Like, play to your own strengths here. No one's going to want to go into the military so they can just be a bit soft, quite frankly. That's not what you would go to the military for. If you're going to be recruited by them, you're going to go because you've got like, right, I've got the guts now. I've got the ability to do this. I've got the physique to do this. I've got the mentality to do it. You're not going to be wanting to be around a certain type of person. I'm sorry. Having said that, I think what Will is saying is true in the sense that, I don't think that children do, or the younger generation does know well enough what is needed and what's required to actually safeguard the country itself, not just them, but the country itself. But I don't think that requires another lesson, quite frankly. That's more on society.
I think, I'm almost totally in agree with you, Tarjinder, but I don't know. It's hard for me. Where I live near the biggest army barracks in the country. I'm not too far from Aldershot, so it's hard to get a perspective for myself for the rest of the country, because for me, where I am, I'd say, oh God, students know loads about the military. It's such an important thing. It's like drilled into them here. You can't get away from it. Recruitment isn't, I guess it is a problem when you look at the numbers. So it is a difficult thing. I think it depends where you live. Where I live, it would seem that, I don't know, the military definitely gets a huge say, but that's because of the area I live in, I think, we got a comment here. Is the military becoming more important today than at any time since 1945? I'm not sure. What do you think, Joe?
It's hard for me to speak about some things. I think Tarjinder just gave me the absolute prime example of what a bunch of people of mixed ages, clearly, but might have a perception about the military and its importance and what it's for. Tarjinder talked very much there about size, physique, not being too soft or whatever. All of my family who've been members of the military do not conform to that sort of army cannon fodder perception that we might have of big burly chaps fighting in special forces or whatever else. Members of my family have gone through different parts of the armed forces, working in a variety of different places that, despite that, I'm still relatively ignorant about in terms of recruitment. But I think the importance of the military from 1945 onwards is a very changed military, a very changed view of what it is that's required, whether it be in things that are to do with computer coding, whether it be in terms of different types of signals intelligence. Back in the days of Morse code, it was relatively straightforward, I guess, or radio listening posts, those kinds of things. Now, all of the things that we rely on for our defence are maybe through the back channels, the back doors, the bits that we don't even know about happening. And neither do our young people, because, as Will said, the history that we teach in school, we teach about going over the top in the First World War. We teach about, sometimes to a lesser extent, fighter commands, brilliance in the Battle of Britain, maybe a little bit less on bomber commands, carpet bombing of Dresden, all of those types of different things. But we teach about that. But we don't teach about spies, intelligence. We don't teach about the people who are building drones, servicing drones. We might watch the news about war in Ukraine and talk about the Russians using drones, the Ukrainians using drones, but we don't talk about how those drones are built, how they're developed, how they're used for military purposes, non-military purposes, who looks after them, who decides where they go, who shoots them out of the sky if they're enemy ones. We don't know enough about those kinds of things. And I think that impacts our understanding of how we might teach about the importance of the military. But the one thing I really did want to jump in on actually was coming from a completely different perspective about what teaching about the military might give us. And that's about the idea of service and serving others. Service is a strong value, a British value, I guess, that we might, in a more selfish and a more negative and a more self-involved society, be something that we gloss over an awful lot. And regardless of what we might feel about individual military conflicts that Britain and the countries have over time become involved in, the notion of service, of serving others, of a serving profession, and I would also include other professions that should be entitled to maybe broader recruitment focus, things like nursing, things like medical profession, those types of serving others can only be a positive value, a good value, because regardless of anything else, when you put on a uniform and you join the military, you serve others, you serve the country with a lot of the time very little thanks and very little regard
I think it's happening
in terms of what it is that you've done.
I think it's happening into something really interesting there, Joe, because you're talking about service. Tarjinder, you were talking about courage, physical bravery. And maybe if you really want to get, let's say, children on engaged, excited about the military, it's the values that it underpins. You've got to inspire with the eternal themes that run right through militaries all over the world over time. And it is, as we said, things like courage, things like service, things like, I guess, comradeship, sacrificing yourself for a higher ideal, all that sort of stuff. Those are the themes that run. Again, it's very historical, but there is a way to really inspire children with those. And to go back to the question that was asked about, is the military becoming more important than today than it was since 1945? Yeah, in some cases, it seems like it is, right? I mean, we have land war in Europe, one country invading another. We have the sort of weakening of NATO. We have threats to what they call the international rules-based order. We have the rise of, let's say, other countries whose interests do not always align with our own, who are only becoming more and more powerful. So yeah, I think the answer to that question is simply yes, it really feels like it. And in many ways, this feels like a very 2025 news story, because there's also that geopolitical dimension, but also there's that thing about young people, especially this crisis of masculinity in young men that we read so much about. This idea that lots of young teenagers not really sure how to see themselves in this world, not really sure how to sort of be men, and it would seem to me that this would offer a roots for at least some of them, a very traditional rules-based system that, as long as you pledge yourself to it, as long as you're willing to sacrifice something of yourself for it, will give you an identity and a meaning. And bit of a story time here, but I'm thinking back to, I've known a few people who I worked with in education who were in the army for 20 odd years before going to work in schools, and they found the change very jarring, because they had 20 years of having their lives kind of being told when to get up, when to go to bed, what to eat, where to go, what to do. So in a sense, they had really got something from that, and then they found it very, very difficult to adjust to life on the outside. Now, what I'm saying is we seem to have lots of young people who seem to struggle with life on the outside already. Perhaps this kind of whatever the military provides you with could really suit some of them.
I do have some problems with that, Will, but what I don't have problems with is our awesome sponsors for today. So have you subscribed to our weekly newsletter yet? It's called Soundbites and Insights, and it's delivered to 10,000 educators a week. It contains a curated selection of 4 standout TTR shows from the week, exclusive discounts and exclusive offers from our sponsors. Sign up on our website at radio.org/newsletter. And John Catt. This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up for your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Just coming back to what you were saying, Will, before I talked about our awesome sponsors for today.
I actually appreciate the smoothness with which you did that as well. Worthy of special forces. You just went in there, you achieved your objective.
So I've got to thank our awesome host for today, Tom Rogers. So whenever I hear that, Will, I start to be very concerned about that language that you hear from certain groups about national service, the military, how it can solve all the problems of society. We'll take these young men. You know what the problem with young people today is? They don't know service. So we should bring back national service. We should, make sure they do some sort of service to the country. The military's the way to sort our problems. You got a problem with masculinity, stick him in the army. I don't know. I have very big reservations about that idea. That the army is the way. I actually think it's socioeconomic why a lot of people join the army at the moment. Maybe that is wrong. And just what I've noticed in the area I'm in. And yeah, it does seem to me that the army has a better shot of recruiting more people due to economic factors and what you were saying about university than the idea of service. I do agree, but I just have problems with this. It falls into indoctrination to me, this idea that somehow the army is the solution to a lot of our society's problems, particularly for young men. I have a bit of a concern with that. I'm not sure what other people think. Tarjinder, what are your thoughts?
But my point is, okay, but what other indoctrination goes on a regular basis that you actually disagree with? Do you see what I mean? Like, it goes on all the time. If you're going to say indoctrination is wrong, fine, let's make it a principle. But what we can't have is, well, the military's doing it, so it's wrong now. It's either wrong or it isn't, And I think to some extent, fair enough, let it be what it will. If people are going to do it anyway, which they have been doing, in many schools, including the teaching of history, which, let's face it, sometimes people have given a very one-sided point of view now, because it's almost like, well, it was too, I don't know, colonial or something, or it was too positive about the military. Now we've got to be completely negative about it. Well, actually, it's not like that's really not our problem. Our problem should be, this is a curriculum, this is how it's sequenced. In terms of military, if they want to do more, there are things like the cadets and things which maybe they need to revive a little bit, and maybe there should be schools, if they're hostile to it, who shouldn't be hostile to it for those reasons. Do you see what I mean? Like, what is the issue there? Because that would have been a prime way of them recruiting, even from like quite a young age, but also giving children something active to do, and another thing that they can actually access. Like, I didn't actually go to the cadets myself, but I had friends who did. And that seemed to be a much more normal thing to do. So maybe they need to come at it from a different angle. But the idea that you're going to stick it on PSHE and it's going to work is just, I'm sorry, it's a nonsense. I don't think it's going to work. I don't think you can make people feel that way about the military. I think they need to think about how to do it in a different way. And also to, when they're doing their careers talks and things like that, they need to be open about like what the possibilities are. But we can't possibly teach everything. We can't make everybody happy in every single situation. We've already tried this, and all we end up with is like an overloaded curriculum, which we can't possibly teach. So it being another thing for us to teach, I don't agree with. But like I said, to the extent that it's indoctrination, well, I'm a bit mad about it, because I think that actually we shouldn't be doing half the things we're doing in schools anyway. Like, we shouldn't be allowing half the ways and the means that teachers teach, particularly in secondary, because they seem to think that it's okay to influence things with their politics. And that shouldn't be going on in the first place. We'd be much stricter on it. But like I said, if it's indoctrination in a system that indoctrinates anyway, well, sorry, but same difference, isn't it?
Yeah, I just had a thought of how you'd even, like, if some teacher isn't teaching the military values in the way that they should be taught, well, how would that even be judged, and what would someone do? But it just came back. I think that's a really good point, Tarjinder. It just brings me back to what you said, Joe, about service. And I guess my concern with that is, again, where would this be taught? Do we have to have a course now on nurses, the NHS, the army? Like, values of service I don't know. I mean, I know it's the schools. It is part of schools' roles, I think. Maybe we disagree on that. But I'm just, again, is it a curriculum role? Is it just something we show young people? How do we do this? And when you were saying, Joe, I was sort of agreeing, but I'm also thinking back to what Tarjinder is saying, oh my God, like what would you even overload? Like what would it look like in schools? I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that, Joe.
I think when I come back to the idea of service, and I work in a school with a very particular ethos that centres around the idea of service and serving others. Servant leadership is a core value that we have. So that idea about serving your community, and that community being from anything from the community that's on your doorstep to the community that's a little bit further afield, and to the global community. That idea and that concept of learning to serve others is something that I guess is the reason I work at that school. I work at that school because that notion of service is important. I view my job, my role in school as serving my community in terms of educating young people. And I would imagine that from my own very personal perspective, I'm not necessarily speaking from a school's perspective now, but it'd be quite easy to talk about the values of particular careers, the value of particular roles in society, and how we can use what we have, what we learn, what we know, the skills that we have in order to serve others. And that concept that, of course, we expect to an extent to be rewarded for our skills and our service. I don't pay my guy who comes around and decorates my house because he's providing me a service. Of course, I pay and reward him for that. But
oh, Joe is frozen.
That service and that thing that I think is applicable regardless. But I have got one more thing to say that occurred to me just around the concept of values and everything else. Does anybody else not think that this is just another way of trying to acknowledge that maybe state schools are needing to be a little bit more like our private school partners? Because if you went to a private school, access to officer training corps type preparations, the military experience is absolutely. Tarjinder's dead right. You can go and join the cadets, but in a private school, for a lot of our young people, and a lot of our young people who would inevitably become officers in our military, they've already got access to that kind of thing. I think back to my university days, and the officer training corps was a big part of university society life. It was a thing. And why shouldn't state school young people have that thing?
Yeah, just because we're running out of time for this one, but just to jump in very quickly, I see we've got viewers from all over Europe and across the world. So hello to Galina, who was saying hi to us from Germany. It's great to have lots of people viewing what is, a really interesting conversation. Sorry, Will, you were about to say something.
Sorry, I was just going to say, we were talking a lot here about what young people could do for the military. But my understanding is ever since they got rid of national service in the 1950s, there have been a lot of people who have said, bring back national service, especially people who read the Daily Telegraph, I would imagine. It's probably a very popular position.
Hey, I read the Daily Telegraph sometimes, Will.
I said popular, not unanimous opinion. And it always tends to be people, who are too old to do national service themselves who conveniently tend to think that. However, having said that, and I'm not, without falling into that trap, I do think that there is most crime, and certainly the vast majority of violent crime is committed by men aged about 16 to 35. It's hard to say exactly why, but basically at a certain age, men become far less likely to commit violent crime or do that sort of thing. So I do think it does benefit society as a whole if there is somewhere for young men to channel their excess of energy, their desire to compete and to do very physical. I don't want to say violent impulses, but if you know what I mean, that sort of stuff that young men have lots and lots of. There needs to be a place for them to take that and to channel it and to learn some skills and to learn some self-discipline and service and all this, that, and the other, to learn these positive attributes on the way and actually make a career out of it and then come out the other end, you know, more as a more complete person than they were going in. And I just feel there's a lot of young people crying out for that sort of guidance in their lives. And actually this could be a solution for a lot of them.
Okay. So I have other things to say about that one, Will, but we'll leave it for the moment because you need to move on to our next story. And this one, I think, I'm just trying to bring it up, is an interesting one. So we're talking about the NASWT elections that are coming up, and there's been a lot of controversy about these. And there is actually going to be a campaign now, an actual election, like, what would you say, vote, which there wasn't going to be before. But the person the actual union has put up, it's controversial for several reasons, Matt Rack. But one of the things I'm interested in is that he is a former firefighters union general secretary. Now we've got Neil, we have a campaign now. I'm just trying to find who it's against. Neil Butler, who is a former teacher. But I guess the question I have, not knowing, I am part of this union, I should say, but without knowing too much about it, is does it matter if the head of the teaching union has never been a teacher? And I think, Joe, you had some interesting comments to add to this as well.
Sorry, I was just stuck on mute for a second. Yeah, I guess that I wholeheartedly believe that somebody who is in charge of a union that's to do with teaching should at least have had some experience of being a teacher of some form or another. I'm not 100% snooty that it has to be somebody, you know, I'm quite happy with university teachers, lecturers, that kind of thing. I'm not saying anything else. But it more led me to the question, realistically, is about what we believe unions are for, what the point of them is, because a lot of the article that you made reference to that was in The Guardian focused on political opinions of this guy and the things that he may or may not have said in the past. And it led me back to thinking about how often I disagree with some of the political standpoints that my union that I'm in, which is not this one, have expressed in the past, and whether I think that's what unions should be doing, engaging with politics outside of the realms of things that directly impact teachers, pupils, schools themselves.
Tarjinder, you must have.
I just want to say here, and so I know I'm interrupting. I just want to say here, Joe. I completely agree with you. I was a member of a different union, and I was a union rep at one point during the sort of strikes in 2022, 2023, over that period, and I think it's very, very sensible for a group of professionals to be part of a professional body that looks out for their interests and advocates for things that are relevant to their job. However, just like you, I would often see my union take, pretty strong political, making statements about things that, as far as I can tell, had very little to do with teaching, and with no particular consultation of the rank and file members over it. And of course, you sort of stay part of the union as well, because, if you're anything like me, you were told when you were training, join a union, it's your insurance policy if if there's a certain allegation or tribunal situation you find yourself in. So it's very smart to be part of one. However, wouldn't it be great to not have to kind of go along with a lot of political statements that you just don't agree with at all?
What are your thoughts, Tarjinder? I know you'll have strong thoughts on this one.
I think, to be fair, generally speaking, unions probably should keep out of politics of it. I certainly didn't, I'm not part of I have got legal representation, but I'm not part of any of the teaching unions, precisely because the one that I was part of seemed to have an opinion on phonics, which I just thought is none of your business, quite frankly. And as far as I'm concerned, they were supporting what were academics opinions on phonics rather than the actual members who are teaching using it. Do you know what I mean? Is that actually it's not your job to back people who are not paying for you on an issue like this? Like, that's just not where you're supposed to be at. Having said that, I think most teachers just don't have the time and the inclination to go into the political side of some of these unions. They're no longer teachers. I get that. So they have time on their hands. And I think, the most political do seem to want to be the people who lead these unions. And I don't think that's going to change. Having said that, my issue here a little bit is actually, what is the role of somebody who leads a union, just any union? Because you could argue that, yes, his experience in the firefighters union actually would serve better because he's got social media training, he knows how to run a large organization, etc. Just being a teacher is not going to give you that. Now, while I think it's important to have some experience or have the knowledge or be willing to get the knowledge, I actually don't have a problem with him not being a teacher, because I think sometimes these organizations need to be run by somebody who's got the skills, not just somebody who's got the background.
Yeah.
Can I extend your question, Dave? Because I think it's an interesting one, and I think it applies to all schools, because of course all schools are led by leaders who, I'm going to make a sweeping assumption here, don't spend much time in a classroom and don't teach their own full-time class. So couldn't you extend the question and say, well, if you're going to be a head teacher of a school or a principal of an academy chain or whatever you want to call it, maybe do you need to have been a teacher first, or do you need to have been a particularly good teacher? Because of course the skills involved in running a school are, I think, like you were saying, Tarjinder, with vis-a-vis leading a union, often very, very different from what is needed to be a good teacher in the classroom.
I think there's something different about leading a union to leading a school, obviously a teaching union. I don't know, Will. I do think you have to have been a teacher to be a principal or a CEO. I think you have to have that understanding. And I think a good principal or a good CEO is still going into classrooms. I mean, obviously a union head isn't, my understanding would be that you're not going into classrooms. And it is that aspect, the people who work for I know you were saying you work for the union, Will, but in my experience...
Well, I never worked for a union.
Sorry,
I was just a workplace rep.
Oh, okay.
It's just a voluntary role. It was just I got the emails from the union and disseminated them.
Yeah, even in my experience, the people who really go into those jobs, and take those, have political views that I would say are different to most average teachers. I think it comes down to, how much do teachers even look at this stuff? What bothers me is that I know it's in The Guardian, but it's got all this stuff from Matt Rack saying, oh, I'm not a Zionist. I do believe in a two-state solution. I'm like, what in the world has that got to do with, it seems bizarre to me, and I don't know how this has happened, that we're in a situation where it's like, what are your political views on Israel and God? And I don't want to get into it in this, but this is being something that's asked of them. What about there's talk about mergers of unions, which he said he's totally against, but it's a lot of, and it's like, no, what is it that we want out of our unions as teachers if we belong to it? And what does it mean? And I do think for a lot that part of the problem is that most teachers just do ignore this stuff. I know with the previous union that I'm not part of, when that union head was elected, and he's quite controversial. I know he's been on Teacher Talk Radio before. Most people who are in my department, everybody in my department who's a member of that union were like, oh, I never looked at anything. I didn't vote. You know what I mean? Who votes in those things? Oh, is that what he's about? Oh, that's a bit odd. It's not something, and it worries me that the unions, we need them. I do think, we can get into a debate about that as an insurance. It does worry me about them getting further and further away from what your just average teacher, if there's such a thing, wants. I don't know what people think about that. I get concerned about this. Is that
I think what you say about Gaza completely highlights the absurdity of some of these political positions. Do you think anyone in Gaza or in Israel is going, yes, we've got the NASUWT on our side, brilliant? Of course not. Absolutely absurd. Why is it an issue? Why are they pronouncing it? What has that got to do with teachers' working conditions in the UK?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. What are your thoughts, Joe?
Interesting how a at the risk of dropping into way more politics, and I think any union has got to have any right to kind of do. I just think references to things like I'm not a Zionist and all of the rest of it are potentially linked into trying to discredit somebody already, that there's shades of that political spectrum where what you think about every single issue must be crawled all over before anybody can be considered to be suitable for any type of public office. As a general concept, I do not believe that teaching unions should get involved in political debate or activism about anything that isn't to do with education. That is their role. And when I talk about education, I mean all aspects of it, from, you know, the state of nurseries and childcare provision, the idea of funding for apprenticeships, that any type of aspect of things to do with education, learning, development of young people within a school system. But when it starts eking into, perhaps as Tarjinder said, how something should be taught, that idea of preferred styles, viewpoints, preferred academics of choice, people who they want to platform or deplatform for political issues about refugees, people coming into countries, not coming into countries, all different kinds. I don't think there's any place for that. And that is chiefly because I'm not allowed to talk about those things openly and with a particular political standpoint in my classroom. So why should somebody who's supposed to be representing me be able to talk about them on a wider stage?
Yeah, and I think just on that point, Joe, I think it touches on another, you said something interesting about it should only impinge on education. I think one of the issues is that some of the heads of the union would say, no, I am talking about education. I mean, we've got a situation where the person who could be the head of the NEU next was at the general meeting the other week saying that schools and teachers should be empowered to talk about, you know, the Palestinian situation. Now, that frightens me to an extent, but it's interesting in that sense, what we might mean by education. I think I know what you mean by it, but what they would be saying, oh no, this is education. It's education of a different type. And that is what concerns me. I guess, Tarjinder, you were saying you're not a member of a union. So what do you see as any role in unions in schools? What's your thought on it?
Look, like from like sort of my own sort of political perspective, like in the past, I'd have been quite pro-union, you know, having been quite left-wing when I was younger. But the fact of the matter is that they don't serve the purpose they should serve. I mean, I actually think it's ridiculous that even with a Conservative government, they didn't just get rid of the unions. I think to some extent it's a game. The fact that we have to go through a union, I don't see why we should have to do that. I think we should just have legal representation, have done with. So I think actually it would serve teachers much better if they were just allowed to go and get a solicitor or a lawyer and fight that way than it would do to go through a union where people aren't necessarily trained. Because, you know, like you say, Will, you were like a rep, you were a teacher yourself. So how well could, you know, most people actually do that role in terms of supporting a teacher, given that being a teacher doesn't mean that you're necessarily good at backing other teachers. You see what I mean? Like that, again, the same way that we're saying that just because you just because you're good at a particular role does not mean that you're
to be fair, I mean, I do. My understanding was if they needed legal representation, I think the unions keep lawyers, you know, on retainer for that. So it's not sort of some random
but not everybody gets it.
You know.
Then there was actually a comment by somebody who said the union didn't support me at all. It depends if they want to support you, but actually that comes down to them. So sometimes what they're doing is they're actually linking up and going, well, we've only got so much money, we can only spend so much of it based on our funds. Whereas if I was going to go myself, I could get myself legal representation. I wouldn't need it through another person, and depending on whether they want to do it or not. So it's not always the case that the union does support you, because sometimes what they're doing is they're looking at their bigger picture with their relationship with the school or with a multi-academy trust, and they're saying, well, actually, it doesn't suit us to really support this X, Y, and Z person, because actually overall we're better off staying, like, you know, basically like having a good relationship with that head teacher or like that mat than we are supporting this individual. So I would rather that they scrap the idea that we have to have a union person there, because like that they can be the only one who actually supports us legally, and just say we can be supported legally by anybody, and then we'll see, won't we, like whether the unions survive or not. Because right now they're surviving because they're being given a privileged position.
they have got a privileged position. Not that I want to get into advertising anybody else but our sponsors, but I should point out there are other organizations that offer that representation that aren't unions. But and it would be interesting to see, since the strike, I've got anecdotal evidence that they are gaining in support, that they are becoming more popular, but nothing more than that. So I don't want to go into it, but it is interesting what you're saying, Tarjinder, because there are alternatives. It's hard to know how, if all this stuff is putting people off and if those alternatives are growing. But you know what else is popular? Our fantastic sponsors for today, which is Teacher Talk radio newsletter. Have you subscribed to our weekly newsletter yet? It's called Sound Bites and Insights, and it's delivered to 10,000 educators a week. It contains a curated selection of 4 standout Teacher Talk radio shows from the week, exclusive discounts, and exclusive offers from our sponsors. Sign up on our website at Teacher Talk Radio, or .org/newsletter. And of course, John Catt. This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. I just thought it was interesting what you were saying, Tarjinder, about the almost not exclusive, because obviously I was saying there are other organizations, but privileged. When I went through my teacher training, that was in Australia a long time ago. Yes, we were told, at the university I was at, you must be part of a union, even if you have no political views, to make sure if there's ever an accusation, anything that ever came up, it's your insurance. You would be mad not to join. And that's always been the case everywhere I've ever taught. And then you say, oh, there actually are alternatives, but I don't think they're talked about. Oh, there's also this alternative where you don't have like the political views. I'm just interested, I guess one, is that still the case? Is that right? Is that what we should be told? But I mean, for me, it wasn't that. We were just told you'd be insane to be a teacher and not be part of a union.
Well, can I suggest another reason, Dave? And I mean, that was exactly my experience as well, and I'm sure the experience of many people. But to throw a number out, so there was an article in Schools Week about teachers' pay being eroded. Since 2010, teachers' pay in the real term earnings have dropped by 18.2%, far more than the rest of the country. So I think collective action, a lot of teachers, if unions are becoming more popular, because a lot of teachers are looking around, they're seeing they're being asked to do more, including making the value of military. Let's add that to all the things teachers have to do. There was being paid less with more demands on their time and, let's say, more demanding attitudes from parents. Given that, a lot of teachers are thinking, God, I will do anything to raise, to stop our salaries sinking even more than they already are. So that's what's driving them to collective action, which, of course, there are unions. We're talking about the plural here. It probably would make a lot more sense if there was one single union, which would obviously give far more strength and collective bargaining power. So I would suggest you were talking about seeing more popularity for unions recently.
Or less, actually. I was wondering if actually more teachers are moving to what Tarjinder was talking about. I don't have the numbers. It would be interesting to look at. Anecdotally, I've heard actually more teachers are moving away from the unions to these sort of paid for insurance schemes. Well, if there was an accusation, that's all they do. They don't do collective bargaining. But I don't know. That's from these organizations I'm not going to name, so they don't sponsor us. But these organizations themselves have claimed they're getting an increase because of the overt political views that say some of the unions are moving to. But like I said, I've no evidence. It could be going the other way. Like you said, there's also the other side of unions, which is collective action, which these groups can't provide. They are simply there in case there's an accusation, and they will pay for your what you would need, legal representation or anything else.
Well, let me ask the question to the group then and to our listeners. Do we think the pay rises of the last few years would have happened without strike action?
I just think it's a bit disingenuous in terms of the pay rises and things like that, because, I mean, it's sort of slightly separate issue because it's on the side, but I don't know if we're just going to have increases in our rate of taxation anyway. So you're giving to me with one hand and you're taking away with the other. Like, let's call a spade a spade. There's no point in dumping 5% or whatever it is on a school, on a multi-academy trust, on whoever it is, making them pay only for you to then take that money away from those teachers anyway. I'd rather you said 1.5 and have done with what's the rigmarole for. Do you know what I mean? It's like,
in that case, just fund it. I mean, in that case, government just make a funded pay rise. Give the schools the money to give.
Well, this is just the point. But can they actually afford to do a funded pay rise? Is that actually going to work? Where's the money going to come from? What concerns me more about government policy is the fact that they are not.
The government lost roughly £1 trillion.
The point is, like, what would actually help teachers and help society in general is if the government actually had policies that meant that we don't have like millionaires and entrepreneurs leaving this country on a daily basis, quite frankly. But like, we've got a brain drain going on. So where they're going to continue to get the money from, I don't know. They're already in trouble because they can't get the receipts on this. So what we're going to do, well, we don't generate the money. We've got to like think about this in a way that's better. It's not just about the increase in terms of money, is about where's that money going to come from, and we can't fund ourselves. We don't make the money. Do you see what I mean? Like, that money's got to come from the private sector. There are people who actually generate money. We don't generate money. We've got to think about that as well.
Well, I think there's two points in that. One, for the money, I mean, just pick a random figure. Over COVID, the government wrote off roughly £1 trillion on lost contracts. So there's definitely waste in the system, and it's to some extent a matter of political will. Another one as well, you talk about we don't make money. Of course, in one sense, we don't generate profit, but in another sense, we absolutely do. One of the things that really hamstrings the British economy for many, many years is the slow productivity or the low productivity, should I say, or the slow growth in productivity of its workers. How on earth are you going to make your economy more productive if you don't invest in education? It's such short-term thinking.
Can we just get back, to Will's question? Was an interesting one. I probably should have an answer for this, but I'm still thinking through it. Joe, what was your thoughts about what Will said about collective action and whether we'd have pay rises without that?
Trade unionist, so I'm afraid that I'm always going to say that I guess my attitude is summed up in what I've said before. I do believe that anyone in any type of trade or industry where possible should join a trade union because of the power of collective action. If we look back at times before trade unions, where people who had, when guilds were in charge of all kinds of different trades and everything else, unless you were part of that guild, you couldn't work and you couldn't do particular things. You couldn't get a better wage, even if you were skilled, if they wouldn't have you join in that kind of thing. People joined together to change that idea. It's part of our history. It's part of our culture to join together to quote an inspector calls, to try for better wages. I think that we wouldn't have the pay rises that we have without collective industrial action over time. I believe that if I am in a trade union and my union calls me out on strike, that I join that strike action or I leave that union. That's because I either believe in it and I stick with it and I push it forward, or I leave because I don't believe in it. Those are my two choices. But I certainly think that trade unions have a really important benefit when they focus on the trade that they are representing, in our case, teachers and education.
I think, I'm trying to think through my answer. I think can it be both? I guess I'm going to sit on the fence here and say, yes, I agree that unions do a good job when they focus on those aspects that teachers, collective bargaining in terms of pay. Where I see some concerns, and again, this is difficult because it's always, I saw this or I saw that, and I saw that from some of our viewers, they've had bad experiences in the union. What do you want at a ground roots level? What you essentially want is the union to stand up for you when something horrible might happen with a student or there's a threat of violence. And that's where I have seen, and again, it's not anecdotal, it's just, I'm just saying about one experience, and it's hard to say, well, this is what's happening everywhere. But I think where teachers feel let down, and where I've seen teachers feel let down, is where yes, it's almost seen as too small and unimportant. This happened to me. A student made a threat of violence. I really needed my union to step in. And I've seen teachers really be fobbed off, told, oh, fill out a form. And when it comes to the big pay action and the big things, that's where it's like exciting and people want to be involved in. And that's where I see teachers have been let down. Having said that, it's not happened to me. It's happened to colleagues of mine that I've seen. So it's always difficult when you're like, oh, I saw this one thing happen. And that could be about the rep at the particular places that I've worked in. But what it was felt by these teachers was they're all like, these incidents were not worth it. When it comes to big things, they're worth it. But this was a minor thing. So there's no real need to get involved. And that's where they saw problems. I also do come back to those issues. I'm not sure how I feel about having a former fireman rep. I don't know how we've got to that we can't find somebody from the education section to be the head of an education union. I'm assuming this guy was a fireman. I mean, I'm expecting he wasn't, some other I'm trying to think of a business here, but off the top of my head, but something else. And then was like, oh, I'll be a fireman's union person and now education. I don't get how we've got into this situation. We've lost Tarjinder for the moment, but I'm not sure what your thoughts are on those, Joe or Will.
Yeah, I think just what Joe was saying earlier about the power of collective bargaining, I think that's so true. I think it was so well put. And I mean, to your question, Dave, should the union leader be a teacher? Well, maybe that would speak to some of the concerns you were talking about. If some people have had bad experiences with their unions, is it far-fetched to suggest that might stem from the leadership of those unions maybe not being teachers themselves? It might seem so. I don't know enough about leadership of unions to know whether this is a one-off but I think you ask an excellent question. It seems weird, doesn't it? Where there being so many teachers out there and so many teachers with opinions out there that they couldn't find one to lead a union.
Yeah. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the issue is that I don't really know enough about union leadership beyond, I'm endlessly surprised by some things that I find out that union leadership of unions I've been in or other unions have said something that I might consider to be, what are you even talking about? Or why do you feel like you need to weigh in on that issue or whatever? But I wonder if, clearly, bearing in mind the fuss that seems to be made about this, I'm assuming that this has never happened before, that everybody else has been a teacher or somebody with education experience. I do have Tarjinder's comment like nagging at the back of my head though about this idea of somebody who has experience of leading a union. Should we dismiss that experience just as easily as saying, oh, well, they're not a teacher, so that's not good enough? Because this guy must have some political savvy, some understanding of how negotiating, let's face it, firefighters unions in the last couple of decades or so, they've hardly been the quiet, shrinking violets. I still remember driving past fire stations and beeping my horn in support of striking firefighters. Should we dismiss all of that experience of negotiating at a national level or whatever that this guy perhaps has that he could bring to national action?
Can I add another example as well? I mean, do you have to be a teacher to be education secretary?
No.
Obviously not. Obviously not.
Yeah. Right. I just think, like the education, my point is, yes, it should be a teacher. Why? Because at a ground roots level, you need to feel like the union gets it. And people who don't feel supported by unions, when you have these individual cases where people feel like the unions haven't taken their particular view seriously, and I know it's difficult and unions have to make difficult decisions, but I think that's where the politics thing becomes a problem, where teachers start to feel, hey, they're more interested in their views on Israel than they are on discipline. And two, I think it's integrity. It gives the unions more integrity when a person can be like, oh, that person was a teacher. I get it. Like, they get it. What do we say about the education secretary? Well, the reason we haven't had good education secretaries is they don't get teaching. They don't know what it's like to be a teacher. They don't know what it's like at the ground level. I'm surprised that the unions have chosen somebody that leaves them open to the same accusation. The same accusation they've made about teaching secretaries, they're now leaving themselves open to it. This guy could be absolutely brilliant. I have no idea. But it leaves you open when you feel, well, how could this person get it? The same, what you just said, I think, well, is the problem with education. And I feel it's strange for the unions to go with somebody that leaves them open to exactly the same problems and claims that they themselves have made over the years about, oh, why don't we have an education secretary that knows anything about teaching or has been to a state school? So we'll choose a fireman. I think that's nuts. But that's my sort of final view on it. We're out of time. Do you guys have any final views on this before we... Cool. Thanks so much for your time. Tarjinder's unfortunately dropped out. We had internet problems, but Joe and Will and Tarjinder, thanks so much today. And yeah, hopefully we'll see everybody tuning in next time. Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.